Ever wonder what the future of work will look like? In the Hope at Work podcast, you will be exposed to new workplace norms, modern technologies, and unconventional ideas, all from a positive point of view. You'll never look at work the same way again. Paul Boatman, so good to have you on the Hope at Work podcast. So I have worked with Paul for a number of years now, and honestly, I still have trouble articulating exactly what you do. So why don't you start by telling us not only about your background, but what your role is at Infor?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me, Marcus. Pleasure to be here. So I'm the head of science at Infor Talent Science. I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist by training. Try to say that 5 times fast. Really, I've dedicated my career to understanding and really trying to improve the relationship between people and their work. And at Infor Talent Science, where I've worked for the last 12 or so years, that's really what we do. So we make use of behavioral assessment to learn about people. And then we work with organizations to build performance profiles, which you can really think of as benchmarks for success in a given role, in a given organization. And so we're able to take what we learn about people and compare them against these performance profiles and really help organizations not just match people to roles, but really to help them develop and flourish in their careers. And so I lead a couple of teams, behavioral scientists and data scientists, who work with this massive volume of data that we have to help organizations do that the most effectively and, of course, grounded in a scientifically rigorous way.
Okay, so 12 years, that's a good amount of time. And over that time, you mentioned the sheer volume of data that you've collected, millions of assessments, right? I think the last number I saw was over 200 million people have taken this assessment. So, Paul, you have access to a tremendous amount of data and the associated insight related to these assessments. Tell me, when you look at the different behavioral characteristics that you all measure, have any risen to the surface? I know that's a generic question that's going to be like, it depends on which role and which industry, but are there any in particular that you see over and over again? Man, this is really important.
So it does depend. So we did some research. We were looking at turnover, which we work with a broad array of different types of jobs in organizations across a wide array of industries. What tends to be the common outcome that organizations care about is turnover. It's a pretty good proxy for how well people are doing in their jobs, how much they're liking their work. And so that tends to be the nice common denominator outcome that we can look at across all of these jobs. And we did this massive research study. Literally a couple 100,000 people were involved in the data set, over 100 organizations. And so in our assessment, we measured 26 different things, call them characteristics about people. Of all of those things, humility was the one that rose to the top.
Really? Interesting. Why do you think there's such an importance of humility?
It's a really interesting question. And I wish the data would just lay that out nice and cleanly for us. It doesn't. I'll speculate and say, I think that part of the way that we measure humility, but also what I think is generally wrapped up in the way that people think about humility, is self-insight. So if I have a more accurate understanding of myself, including both my strengths as well as my weaknesses or my opportunities, if I've got a better sense for that, I'm probably more likely to put myself in situations that align with those strengths and that maybe don't align with areas where I might struggle. And so I might be less likely to overextend myself at work. I suspect that's the primary thing that's going on there.
Okay, that makes sense. So speaking of this self-insight, when you administer these assessments to people over the last couple of decades now that this particular assessment has been around, do you find that people frequently identify tendencies that they maybe were unaware of, that they didn't recognize about themselves? In other words, do you think people actually have good self-insight, or do they not when they come out of this assessment and learn new things?
Yeah, it's such a good question. As with all of this stuff, it varies. I do think that when we're talking about these types of assessments, and frankly, these types of assessments were often It's based on how people respond to a questionnaire about themselves. It's pretty rare that we are uncovering something entirely new about a person. I think what tends to be more the case is that we're surfacing things about people that maybe were sitting just below their awareness, weren't necessarily part of their core self-image, but you tell them that this thing about themselves and they say, okay, yeah, that tracks. But that's not how, maybe if you would have asked me to describe myself, it probably wouldn't have been maybe one of the 2 or 3 things I would have said about myself.
Okay, again, makes sense. Now, along those same lines, I imagine that there's some change in people over time that would contribute to things that maybe have grown in importance, but they wouldn't have put in that conscious awareness. Like, do people change a lot over time, and therefore this behavioral assessment that we've created would capture a little bit of a different profile over time?
Not a ton. So there's a lot of psychology research behind this, that people's core selves tend to develop pretty early, tend to get set on a track pretty early. And you definitely see some deviations, especially earlier in people's careers, as they face different opportunities, as they face different experiences that maybe tap into aspects of themselves that they weren't as aware of, even being there, can change how they respond. But generally speaking, you see a pretty high degree of consistency within people across time. If you ask people to describe themselves, describe their personality, one of the most common things that you'll hear people talk about is how outgoing they are. So whether they're extroverted, whether they're introverted, where they fall on that spectrum. So using that as an example, you're not going to find a lot of people who throughout their lives change from being extremely extroverted to extremely introverted, or vice versa. You're probably seeing people dance a little bit on one side of the spectrum or the other, or maybe people who tend to be toward the middle of the spectrum, they're going to dance to one side or the other.
What happens when employees behave badly? Boy, we could do an entire TV show, maybe a Netflix special on that. Well, Ryan and I sat down and recorded episodes for FAMA, and we asked practitioners, give us your most outrageous story. The sales leader that brings cocaine to work, whatever. Just bring us the outrageous, and it is funny. So if you need a laugh, which we all do from time to time, search for workplace misconduct wherever you get your podcast, and you'll find it. And trust me, you will laugh and cry, but you'll definitely laugh. All right. Thank you.
Understood. Okay. That's super helpful. So I'm going to switch gears on you. Let's talk about these new generative AI models. So my question to you, Paul, is what if generative AI had access to this behavioral profile? So it knew me, it understood those 26 different behavioral characteristics that I possess, my behavioral DNA, if you will. And it would respond differently to me than it would to you, because it knows maybe I'm not a very detail-oriented person. And so it needs to be really clear in laying out the recommendations. Is that A, possible, and B, a good idea?
It's a really cool idea. I'll start with, is it possible, and maybe what might it look like? We can get into the is it a good idea in a minute. So I guess I'll start by saying, it reminds me of a conversation I had. It was barely over a year ago. And yet at the time I was having the conversation, it felt like the adoption of this generative AI was barely in its infancy. I had not used ChatGPT before, but I was talking to someone who I would describe as an early adopter of the technology. And one of the things that she was saying to me was ChatGPT, Gen AI in general, is really good at persona exploration. In other words, help me understand how this person or this type of person might behave in a given scenario, or how they might respond to a given prompt or whatever. Tip for your readers, I'll just describe it a way that I use it often, is if I'm preparing for a meeting, let's say I'm planning to meet with a head of operations at so-and-so organization. I'll type in, hey, ChatGPT, you are the head of operations at a large, what have you, let's say healthcare organization. What do you care about most? How might you respond to these challenges? How might you respond to this idea? These kinds of things. And then ChatGPT will then take on the persona of this operations leader and respond to me in kind. So based on that kind of idea, what if we were able to get even more granular with this persona description, right? So just as you described, Marcus. So now it's not just you're generally an operations head. You are a operations head with so-and-so characteristics or so-and-so behavioral preferences. Now, how would you respond? And I could see that having a ton of different applications. So first of all, what it makes me think of is coaching engagements. So imagine you're a leader and you're preparing to have a challenging discussion with one of your people. How nice would it be to leverage Gen AI to help you understand what might be the most effective way to get through to this person based on their preferences? Maybe even role play with it and say, I want you to take on the persona of this employee of mine and push back against me as you might if you had this behavioral profile, or what activities might best get through to you, what questions might most maybe trigger thoughts in your brain. By the way, to put another layer on top of that, what if I could also upload my own behavioral characteristics as a leader? So now we're talking from both ends of the spectrum. I tend to be this way. My employee tends to be this way. Here's our friction points. How can we best work together?
It's funny you say that. I remember you and I being at a client site a few years ago and doing a team dynamics exercise with this talent science profile, and the CEO and the CFO learned about each other. I remember the CFO had this epiphany when the CEO's profile was shared, and it turned out she wasn't a very detail-driven or data-driven person. She made decisions based on intuition. So it gives us insights about other individuals that we maybe wouldn't have had. And so I think it's so interesting that technology is actually going to allow us to have more human experiences at work because we have access to this information and this data. Where do you see this evolving over time with using very standard assessments like we have that we've been using for years, combining it with this new technology?
Yeah, and it takes me back to thinking about role-playing and using Gen AI to take on the persona of this other person. How would they like to be talked to? What are their interests? What are their desires? What are their trigger points that I want to try to avoid? And let's try out this conversation together and let me know where I trip up, or help me identify where I trip up. Historically, we haven't had access to how others want to be treated. And so does this give us the opportunity to now take that next step up by being able to not just know, but experiment with, in a safe setting, how others would like to be treated?
So role-playing, coaching, so many opportunities to use these new technologies. Really appreciate your insight and perspective. The technology might actually enable human beings to be more empathetic. Paul, you know what? We're running out of time here. Unfortunately, we try to keep these pretty brief, but really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your insight and perspective. We definitely need to do this again. But again, thanks for joining us today.
That would be great. Thanks so much, Marcus. Thanks for having me.